Our topic today is finding happiness, which is of course related to our movie, but it doesn't have to be related to the movie because it is really the essence of the spiritual path. Some of you have seen the movie in this last week. If you haven't watched it yet, you can download it easily from the internet now. It's not hard to find. And it is the stories of our Ananda communities and a lot of beautiful footage with Swami Kriyananda. But the name of the movie actually came after it was completely finished. In the several years of raising money and then a year of production, that it had 100 different names. The Ananda movie was the main one, which was considered to be pretty much of a non-commercial, a non-starter in that respect. Finally, after the entire movie was finished, our director, Ted Nicklau, who was very, very tuned into it and also tuned into it from a professional point of view, he just one day just said, you know, he's watched this movie more than anyone because the editor does. He says the theme through the whole movie is finding happiness. So you go back and you sort of hear it everywhere, but in fact it came out afterwards. It was once the movie was assembled, oh, this is what it's about. Interestingly, when we had what's known as the director's cut, which is the first version of a movie before anything is polished, before the soundtrack is on or anything, but it's the essence of a film. I and others learned about filmmaking from doing this. I didn't know anything about it. I hope to do more because I loved it, but that's just beside the point. So you take the, Swami Kriyananda was in India, and no one felt they could go forward until Swami saw the director's cut. And as it happened, I was traveling to India at that time, and he was in Goa. So this would have been 2013, probably just the beginning. He died in 13, so it must have been 2012. Yeah, January 2012. And I flew to India and I rerouted myself and went to Goa where he was and went over to his hotel room. Kirtani and Ananda and Shurjo and Narayani were there. I think that was all, just the five of us. Maybe Miriam might have been there. No, actually she wasn't, but that doesn't matter. And we showed it to Swamiji, and it was a mess. I brought a small hard drive, and the video was on the hard drive, and I also brought a DVD, because I knew he was in this hotel, and I'd been in that hotel, so I knew they had a DVD system and so on. Swamiji is still very hard of hearing, and especially when it's projected like through a television, it's a little tricky. So he had high quality earphones in order to be able to hear. But for some reason, plugging them into the television, he couldn't quite see it, and he didn't want to watch it on the computer screen. So he actually did the picture on the DVD and the sound through the computer and tried to sync them. And they started out synced, but I realized about halfway through that they were slipping. So by the end, when he was watching it, it was several seconds of difference. He would hear the sound differently than he was watching it. But it didn't have any effect on his experience of it. In fact, it was really, in decades of experience with Swami, it was way up there as one of the most moving experiences ever. When Shivani was given this assignment, she's the woman who produced this. If you've never met Shivani, you have an experience in front of you. Hi, Shivani. Just wanted you to know. Everybody knows this. I'm smiling to the camera in case she ever sees this, which she probably won't. She's not a very tall person, and she's getting shorter. But we call her distilled. She's just distilled down to the essence of willpower. And she's very strong. And 5 years ago, Swamiji asked her if she could make this movie. She could see that this movie was made, knowing zero about producing movies, nothing at all, having no money. He just asked her if she would do it because he knew she could. And she did, just by that just absolute unwillingness to give up. But this was the part that was really impressive. In all her years at Ananda, just because of the work that she'd done, all of us feel that we're all working for Swami in the sense of it's the project that he was given to do by Master, and we were born at the time that we can help him do it. That was our job. We didn't get the commission directly, but we got it. We're his troops in this project. But Shivani said Swami had never asked her directly to do anything for him. You know, here's my project, would you see it through? So she took it very much to heart, because as it turned out, it was the big one. And her idea in her mind was that she wanted to make a film that would show Swamiji the completion and the success of his mission. Because he took very seriously from Master, you have a great work to do. He took very seriously from Master that the communities was really fundamental, and no other disciple had picked up that commission at all. Swamiji often comments at the garden party in Beverly Hills in whatever, 1949, I think it was. He said there were 800 people there, and almost all of Master's direct disciples, especially the ones who were in the ashram, were all there. And not one of them, as in Swami's mind, heard what he said or responded to it personally. He was the only one who did. And he didn't say that in a castigating way toward people who didn't. He was simply saying that the responsibility was really on him. And so he had to put himself into this. And I'll digress here because I know it'll be of interest to you. I met Swami in 1969, just before Thanksgiving. And as many of you have heard me say, and I've written in various places, I had an instantaneous recognition. The words, I've added more sophisticated words to the experience afterwards. In the moment, it was much more simple. And because I didn't know that 45 years later, here I'd be, it was just, I was 22, I was looking for meaning in life, and I was looking for someone who knew something about meaning in life, which, as you all know, is not so easy to find. Lots of people running around on the sidewalk, but not many of them really have any idea where they came from or where they're going. So Swamiji walked into the room where I was at that time, and just whatever he brought into the room, whatever that was, of consciousness, of reality, of parting the veil, whatever you would call it, I just saw it, and I knew it was exactly what I was looking for, that he had it, and that I could learn it from him. And just like that. He hadn't even spoken. Later he spoke, and I remember thinking, this is the most intelligent man I have ever heard. I don't remember a word of what he said. But even at the time, and especially in retrospect, it was extra that he was so intelligent and funny and entertaining, because I wasn't magnetized to him first for that. I just thought, oh, isn't that dear? This is also going to be really fun, you know? Which in fact it did turn out to be really, really fun, because he was so fun. But he could have been Mon, he could have been silent, and it wouldn't have mattered, because it was the consciousness I was looking for. He was 44, I believe, at that time. And let's see, what would he be? Well, he was born in 1926. It was 1969, so whatever that math is, 45. And just strong and dynamic. I mean, many of you who came later only saw him when he was elderly. And because a lot of karma went through his body, he didn't remain stalwart. His spirit remained stalwart, but his body became almost comically enfeebled. I mean, in the terms of just the contrast. I say comically because the contrast between his consciousness and his body just began to separate like that. And he would have to be helped out and placed in a chair, you know, just like we were laughing once. He was introduced once as one of the last living disciples of Master, and it was like we called central casting and asked for the last living disciple. You know? He came staggering out, and there he was perfect. And then his energy, of course, as soon as he didn't have to move his body, as soon as his body was settled somewhere, then his consciousness was. And his face, even, he would look like he was a child almost at times. But when I met him, he was at the height of his physical powers too, and he was a very strong man, with the energization exercises. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. This is in my book, but the man's name was Karuna. He was an Australian. He's passed over to the other side now, but he was a very Australian, which is, apparently in Australia they have an attitude called tall poppy syndrome. I mean, this is something I just learned, where they don't like any of the poppies in the field to be taller than any of the others. They like them all to be just right at the same level. And if there's a tall poppy, their inclination is to cut him down. So Karuna's inclination towards Swamiji was not automatically reverential. It was very much a question of, who is this guy? So he was, his wife was very keen, and his condition for going to see him was that they could sit in the back, but when they arrived, the only seats were in the front. And Swami came out onto the lectern. It was Sacramento, and he was wearing an extremely loud Hawaiian shirt. He had a couple of these that he would wear sometimes. I can't imagine him actually giving a program in that shirt, but that seems to be what he remembers. Maybe I have it wrong now. I have to look it up in my own book. But he says he walked out, and there was a time when Swami had a lot more weight on his body, so he was big like this, always with a big chest. And Karuna was just not, he didn't know what to think. And Swami starts talking about physical strength and the energization exercises. And he's a writer. The only exercise that he gets is pushing a pen or working like this, but he does the energization, and his muscles are so strong, and he makes Karuna come up. Feel this muscle like steel. And Karuna is just like beyond himself. I've never seen Swami do anything like this, and I can only imagine also that it got exaggerated in Karuna's mind. But nonetheless, this is how it happened. And so Karuna just comes up, and the last thing he wants to do is feel this guy's muscle like this. So like not in his picture, but he touched his muscle, and then Karuna tried to explain. He said, like steel didn't begin to describe it. He said it was just an immovable force of energy. And the power of the physical contact kind of knocked Karuna over a little bit. And then he finally takes his seat. So he was just in a daze after that. You know? Who knows? And then, of course, he joined Ananda and was dedicated and loyal for the rest of his life. But Swami had that kind of energy. That's what he was like when I met him. And he moved strong. I don't think it's in this movie. I can't actually remember. I think I saw it somewhere else. Picture of Swamiji in those years, early 70s, coming out of the temple at the meditation retreat. And he often wore an Indian dhoti, which is like a sarong, like a skirt. So it had a split. And he just stood on one foot, lifted his leg, and put on his own sandal, which by that point in Swami's life, you know, he would sit in a chair and somebody else would put his shoes on. So just to see him standing there on one leg, and the sarong parts, and he has these huge muscular calves, and he pulls on his own sandal, just like, my goodness, the physical world is really something, how everything changes. Now, where I'm going with all of this is, I remember people often ask me, therefore, have often asked me, was Swami different at the end than he was at the beginning? And all the years that I've known him, has he changed? It was a good question. Well, he's definitely changed. He couldn't possibly stand on one leg and put on his own sandal. And the muscles that he had, he just shriveled down like elderly people sometimes do. And he, had very little appetite. And so he was a very different kind of fellow. Toward the end of his life, his personality shifted to a certain extent. But he was never any different. The consciousness that walked into the room when I saw him in 1969 was exactly the same consciousness that he had the last time I saw him in his house in India, when he waved at me from the chair because it was too difficult to get up, and I walked out of the room. That was March of 2013. But his way of presenting himself to the world changed enormously. Because at the beginning, and this is where I was starting with this now, I remember, he had that to do. He had this great work that he set out to accomplish. And even for a highly evolved soul, once they incarnate on this planet, they have to participate in the way the planet works. That's something that we really have to understand. Even Master did. We're going to be walking around, this is relating to where we are right now and where we're going to go. A Master has, the access to that infinite power, but when a Master incarnates and becomes what we would call an avatar living among us, he is also bound by the rules of this world. Because as Master himself said, what good would it do if he wasn't? I mean, occasionally he showed that he could just ignore it when he wanted to, when the wishing well fell on his foot and his foot was crushed. And he said, oh, now I'll relate to my body. And then all of a sudden his face is contorted with pain and he can't put any weight on it. Now he said, I'll lift my mind into superconsciousness. And his face goes completely relaxed and he walks just perfectly comfortably on his crushed foot. And someone asked me, how did he attract so many thousands of people? Because he went back and forth across the country and filled the largest halls in all the cities. You see some of the advertisements, they're so marvelous. Educator from India, bringing, special techniques, healing this, healing that, lots of different type fonts, and then there's a big picture of him. I mean, he was a phenomenon just on the level of exotic and unusual. But he often did phenomenal things on the stage. I saw one advertisement, written advertisement, that described, scientific healing methods, demonstrated on the stage, and then it said, bring your sick friends. And there were many examples of him curing people. I mean, Rajasi himself talked about being cured. Dayamata talked about being cured. And I'm sure there were many, many others. That is going to send a crowd the next time, isn't it? Either to see if he's true or if he's a charlatan. I mean, among other things. And he demonstrated strength, and he demonstrated control over his heartbeat and his breath. He would invite doctors up, and he'd have one taking his pulse on this side and one taking his pulse on the other. And then this would be one pulse, this would be another. This one would stop, this one would take over, this one would stop, this one would take over. I mean, that attracts people's attention. And Master was in his 20s, and he had that youthful energy, and he was very exotic looking. We're much more accustomed. I mean, this was already 1948, I presume. 46. That was when the book was published. I don't know if this picture was taken at that time or not. Probably it was taken earlier, because I think it was on the altars much earlier when I think about it. But when you see pictures of Master when he first came over on the boat, with the long hair and the turban and the beard, and he was very, very dramatic looking, and he played it. He knew what he was doing. I mean, he wasn't here to not make an impact. He was here to get the attention of these Americans and find his admittedly handful of disciples, but also like Johnny Appleseed, just to throw the seeds of possibility out, touch the lives of tens of thousands. It's very interesting in some of the Edgar Cayce readings. He talks about the number of people whose lives intersected with the life of Jesus. And he would say, I've never heard of him saying, oh, well, you were the apostle so-and-so. It was more just like you were standing on the street when Jesus went by. You were there when he was carrying the cross. You saw him here. He healed your mother, something like that. But there was some intersection. But the significant point is, Cayce would say to many of these disciples, and you have been integrating that contact into your life ever since. Because when a Master comes into your aura and implants in you that awakening possibility, it's held like the star, literally, above you, and then you have to spend a lot of time bringing everything into harmony with that, because all of this other karma is resisting that and is trying to pull this way, but I always think of it when we used to take groups to India and we would have these very fantastic experiences of pilgrimage in many places, then it's time to go home. Everybody's nervous about re-entry, re-entry back into normal life, because it is different. But I would say pilgrimage is like planting a little tiny seed of radioactivity right in your heart. And it's just going to quietly mutate the whole system. But it's going to take a little while. And so even if you lose contact with that process, it never stops once it starts. As Master put it, once you taste nectar, you just can't go back to eating stale bread anymore. It just doesn't work, even though you may try. But you'll keep coming back. That's in India, they have the statement, one moment in the company of a saint will be your raft over the ocean of delusion. And that's the truth of that. That's why that the whole flow of Ananda's work in India is so completely different, because everybody's intent, as Swami says, is to dive to his feet. And you'll see in our Ananda movie, there's just a frame or two, and you see all these people holding hands like this, devotees wearing white scarves holding hands like this while they bring Swami in, because otherwise he can never get from the door to the lectern, because everybody they're much more concerned about getting that one moment touch, and their belief in it is intense. So people would have to literally hold the crowd back until he could get to the front. Otherwise, he could never get in or out. It became rather tricky for him to move about, especially as he grew older, as he grew more enfeebled. Well, let me just sort of try to unravel the threads and think where I was on all of this. Oh, so Master was here, and he had all the power of the universe at his disposal, but he had to use it through the laws of this world. And he would transcend those laws completely, but only for a purpose. He wouldn't transcend them, for example, to say, oh, we need a temple at Encinitas. Whoa, there it is. Just like Babaji did. He wanted to initiate Lahiri Mahashaya. He just made a temple. There was no building permits. There were no backhoes, It was just like, whoa, there's a temple. And Master had all the power of the universe at his command, but where would the example be? We would all just be falling at his feet, lying there, waiting for him to do it again. And that wouldn't take us where we needed to go. So Master was intensely hardworking. And all that driving back and forth across the country and all those lecture tours and just everything, letters and counseling and building and designing and raising money. And when you read, let's see, I'm not sure what's published and what isn't, but the letters between Master and Rajasi, are those published in any kind of public way, the letters between Master and Rajasi? Okay, some things, we got access to some things. One gets access to things from a lot of different ways, and then I lose track. But what's very interesting is how constantly Master was asking Rajasi to give him money. Oh, it's in Durga Mata's book. That is published. Trilogy of Divine Love, which is a very good book. She talks a lot about how Master was always needing money and always asking Rajasi for money and Dr. Lewis for money and other people for money. And you like to think that he just sailed through and it, never needed anything, but it was constant. And it was always right on the edge. And even when you hear the stories, you hear them in retrospect, and if you don't really put yourself there, you don't realize how very human and real those dramas were. It's easy to say afterwards, oh, Master was able to do it. But Master was able to do it because he applied himself to working through the resistance of the material plane and pulling those forces together. So when Swamiji was assigned by Master this great work that he was supposed to do, it was by no means obvious to Swamiji that, of course, this would get done. He was 22 years old, he was 25. He met Master, he had 3.5 years. He was 25 years old when Master died. He made the rest of his spiritual life on that and never wavered from it. I mean, that was enough. And he was assigned to do this, this commission, and he never wavered from it. It got him kicked out of SRF. It put him completely on his own, but it didn't matter. He just had to do what he had to do. He was not going to give it up. It was the essential conflict between himself and Self-Realization Fellowship, as they were moving so slowly and not at all moving in the directions that Swamiji felt Master wanted at least him to go. He finally was sent to India, and he was in India for 4 years, and being 10,000 miles away and able to make more of his own decisions, he began finally to be able to move the work of Master in the way that he felt inwardly that it ought to be moved. And for those of you, most of you know the story, he received permission from Nehru to build a temple in the heart of the city of Delhi, which was no small accomplishment, an enormous accomplishment. He had the funds to do it, he had the government permission, he had the land, it was all in place. He was going to put Master's work on the map in the capital of India at the time when the whole country was run from Delhi. I mean, it was 2,000 other societies had tried to get permission to have land and build there. All of them had been denied, and Swami had succeeded. And then the people in Los Angeles didn't want it. They thought that it was, who knows, they thought Swamiji was going beyond his instructions. They thought he had nefarious motives. Who knows what it was. So it was just absolutely stopped. And to this day, it's never come through. Although various of our friends in India periodically go to the government offices and try to find the trail, because people tell us if we can find the trail, if we can prove, because the land is still sitting there. Yeah, that if we can prove that Nehru gave it to us, then conceivably we could build on it. So there's 1 or 2 devotees in India who have sort of made it their hobby to keep seeing if we can get this thing through. I don't know, maybe it will come through or not. But that's the kind of power he had. And then when SRF decided that they were just too far out of tune with each other, which in truth he was, when I read about Swami's separation from SRF and when we went through all the years of litigation and Swami began to be more frank about his experience, which prior to that time he just told us the good parts. I said to him at one point, "It's no surprise to me, sir, that they finally expelled you. The wonder is that they kept you so long." Because he just was from another planet in terms of what they were doing. They had their own reality and they were going just fine. And every so often, I mean, Swamiji was the only man. And I always had this picture of, you know, like a pesky little brother, that you're there with all your dolls and you've got it set up, and then your little brother comes in with his tractor and drives right through, you know, your little city and just knocks it all down. I mean, that's way too trivial for something so important, but that's sort of what happened. Just constant. And the little guy is just doing what he's born to do, but they don't match like this. So by the time I met Swami in 1969, this is 7 years after he's been released from SRF. Released is how I like to think of it. And, you know, he was intent. Imagine, I mean, Master had told him, you know, your life will be one of intense activity as well as meditation. Intense activity, and you have this work to do, and at the end of it you will attain liberation. You'll be freed. You'll realize God, but not till all this is done. I mean, there you are. That's what you're thinking about. So he just went out like this with this laser force. And he had the energy and the youth at that time, and that's when I met him. But there was always this other reality behind it. You know, there was the way that I and others would work, and then there was the way that he would work. He worked, you know, 100 times more energy, more constant. I never knew him to take a whole day off. I mean, he would rest. He was actually quite balanced. He would finish a big project. He would take some time off for a holiday. He would at least go out and celebrate, go out to dinner, you know, and he relaxed with friends. He would have people over for tea almost every day, and he would relax. But even when he was in the hospital having open heart surgery, he was editing a book before the surgery and immediately after. And he never let any time go by. He had this great sense that there's a lot to do and I just have to do it all. And the only time he would pause in that when it was a necessary regeneration of his energy. And then he would pause. But once his energy was regenerated, he would just go again. So the personality was very different. But the consciousness was always, I had no edges. That's the word that I generally use. I don't know how, because I'm not on that state of consciousness. I only know how I could receive it, the piece of it I could see. It just had no edges. But he masked it, especially in those early years. I mean, even the fact that he was the leader of Ananda, odd as that may sound to you all, was not an accepted fact. He was the man who lived there, and it was like the only way you could understand who he was is if you discovered it internally. And as time passed, and we got into the 80s and more into the 90s, and his position began to become more self-evident. And habits started, which were not there at all at the beginning, which people would stand up when he came into the room. Nobody would stand up when he came into the room. He'd wander in his Bermuda shorts and his flowered Hawaiian shirt, and would just, "Hi, Swami," just like this. But as time passed, I think the spontaneous reverence for him began to grow, and more of the signs of that kind of respect began to show. Of course, once he went to India, everything changed. But I was, on one hand, I was happy that more people understood, and I also lamented it. Because all of a sudden now, your response to Swami could be imitative. It did not have to be original. You could just sort of look around and see how everybody behaves and behave the same. When there was no external frou-frou, whatever you sensed about him, it was because you figured it out, not because it was the culture of Ananda. But as he grew older, and as it became more obvious that he had done it, and there was a certain point, actually, it was just before he went to India, that he said, one of the things that Master had given him to do, one of the many things, was to write down his words and then eventually to write about him. So Swami wrote The New Path, and then he wrote The Essence of Self-Realization, particularly, and a number of other books in which Master was often quoted. And then finally he wrote Conversations with Yogananda. And he wrote that, I think it came out about 2003. Actually, that's when it did come out. And that was the end of it. That was the last. It's like everything that he had written down was now published. And I just found it from my friend Naidruva, I didn't realize that Swami actually gave her those notebooks and asked her to read through them carefully and look at everything published and make sure nothing had been missed. Right? But he had done it. It was finished. And he thought his life was finished because Ananda was going really well in America, Ananda was growing really well in Europe, and he just thought he was done. And he was very, there was a time when his heart was very weak. His heart would often just go the karma that went through his body was not all his own. And so therefore there was very little logic to the way his body would respond. He would go right to the edge of death and then the next day be having dinner somewhere out, and just be fine. I mean, be released from the hospital and, well, we better take you home. So, oh no, he said, we're in town. I mean, let's go over to the Meridian, let's have dinner. Let's call so-and-so. And you would just expect this, enfeebled person to just come in, and he would just come in as peppy as it could be because whatever the karmic cycle was done. But he was in one of those periods, and he was in Italy, and his heart was very weak, and he used to be on the phone. The last 5 or 6 years of his life, he stopped using the phone. But prior to that, he would call a lot. We had a dedicated line in our house that it was only his number, because sometimes you didn't want to answer the phone, but if it might have been him, you always had to answer the phone. So finally we solved it by just giving him his own number. It was before cell phones with special rings, So, but he was saying that he was talking about that night, the night before, he said he'd just been so close to leaving his body. And he felt like he could. He felt like he was done. And I remarked to him that, sir, if it's time for you to leave, it would be so selfish of us to ask you to stay. You've done the work of 10 men already, and you've given us everything you can. It's not right. But then I said to him, sir, it won't be as much fun to be on this planet after you're gone. Because the sort of returning cycle of Swami Kriyananda really pepped it up. It was the joy bubble that would float through and then make everything work for a while. But he answered me so seriously, speaking of when Master died. I know, he said, I've been through it. And it was very touching, because he was really, I understand what this will be like. But then, instead of dying, he calls up and said, I think I'll move to India. He said, it's 77 or 78. He said, it's a bit odd for a person of my age and my health to go to India, he said, but I think I should go back to India. And he pretended that we were all going to discuss it, which is what he sometimes did. So Durga and Vidura and Jyotish and Devi and David and I flew over from America. He was in India to meet with him and with Ananda and Kirtani. He was in Italy to talk about whether he was going to go to India or not. So we arrive in Rome and we get on the 6 of us, we get on the train to go to Assisi. We get to Assisi and Swami's on the platform meeting us. And we all go to this pizza restaurant, which is right near the train station, walk over to it. And we're sitting there, and we had ordered the pizza, but before it arrived, it was quite clear that this was not a discussion. It was, well, I'm feeling that I should go. What do you think? So what are we supposed to say? No. The obvious answer was, sure. If this is what you feel to do, then this is what we should do. But it was so like, this is the next step. This is what God wants me to do. And he said, the climate of India. He said, the climate of India will kill me. He said, it nearly killed me the last time. And he said, it'll be really tough at my age. But he said it. And then we're sitting at the table, and Vidura, who's ever practical, says to Swamiji, what city will you go to? Where will you go? India's a big place. And we chatted a little bit about the south versus the north. Swami just looked at Delhi, like that. Like that's where he had been when he was kicked out of SRF. And so, of course, he was just going to go back. And then he writes this little brochure, and this brochure is, Nehru gave me the land, and it was like no time had passed in his mind. It's like this was unfinished business, and it was just like he'd lifted his foot, and whatever, 40 years had intervened, and now he was just going to put his foot down again, exactly where it had been before. Swami's sense of time is extremely interesting. This is a ridiculous little interlude here, but I'm going to still say it. One of my very first working for Swamiji experiences was he invited Devi and I over and asked if we would help clean his house. He was just making up something to have us around, but it was also a real teaching experience for me, learning experience. And during one of those cycles, he had this silver cup, and it had some kind of a colored powder in it, which is the powder from India, kumkum powder, he called it, where you make a mark at the spiritual eye. And he would hold that cup when he gave Kriya. He was the only one who gave Kriya for many years. He would hold that cup and he would bless each one of us, and the mark would be left like this. So I'm being very linear. He was giving Kriya then about twice a year only. So this cup is sitting on his shelf, and so I think, I'll take the powder out, I'll put it in a jar, I'll put a lid on it, I'll label it kumkum powder, like this. I'll wash the little cup, I'll put it away. I'm in the middle of doing this, and his house was just the dome, but there were partitions, and his bed was in a loft over here, but you're still just in one room. So I'm in his office, and I'm there, and it wasn't inappropriate for me to be straightening up like that, but I have my hand on this cup like this. And then I hear Swami's voice from the bedroom, leave that there, he says. But then I loved what he said. He said, I'm using it. And he was using it every 6 months. But in the flow of his consciousness, it was an active part of his life. It was just, he's using it because he gives Kriya, and then when he gives Kriya, he uses it. Why would you put it away? It's an active part of his life. And this whole business of building and taking Master's work back to India was just part of his life. And it had been in suspension, almost complete suspension, for 40 years. But 50 years? 40 years. And it just was still there exactly for him to do it. And so Vidura, being completely practical, says, well, if you're going to Delhi, you're going to need a place to be. You know, where are you going to go? Because he was also asking the 6 of us if we would come along and just help get started, because there was nothing going on. So at that point, Vidura gets up from the table, Shivani gets up from the table, and by the time the pizza arrives, they're talking to travel agents. And by the time we consumed it, there were tickets. Vidura and David had tickets to India. Arjuna, Shivani's husband Arjuna, was already there. They were in touch with him. They were looking for a realtor. By the next day, Durga and I had tickets. We were going to catch up to them a couple of days later. And they actually went there, and the house that Ananda lived in for the first 8 years there, the house that was called 10 by 8, that big house, they went over there and they found that and just rented it and set it up for Swami to come and do that work. And then the rest is history, all that's happened there in India. And a day or two later, we were again having pizza. We were again in a restaurant having pizza. We seem to have apparently gone to have pizza a lot during those days. And Arjuna calls Shivani and describes the house that we ended up renting. And it just sounded perfect. It was the perfect location. Here's even more interesting. Years earlier, Shivani and Arjuna had been in that neighborhood and seen those houses being constructed. They think they may have actually even seen that house and said, this would be a perfect ashram for us. And it's just like all these threads, we don't even know what we're doing. And then here we are, we're just following it through afterwards. So she says they've got this house, sort of getting the final, okay, let's negotiate, let's take a lease. If we're going to do this, we're going to do this. I was sitting next to Swami, and he quoted out of the autobiography. He quoted when Master felt drawn to come to America. That wonderful scene, all the faces come in front of him, and Americans, these must be Americans. I love the childlike way Master does this. Oh, these are Americans. I guess I'll go to America. Like that. But it's real when it happens. I mean, think of it. He'd started that school in India. He was running it. It was going great guns. It was fabulous. He goes in to meditate in the morning, and in the afternoon he's gone. And never comes back. I mean, think about it from their point of view. He puts someone else in charge and he's gone. I mean, we're so small and unimaginative in how we move, and they just get this power and they just move with it. They're still operating with the things of this world, but they're using everything that is possible to apply. So he went to Sri Yukteswar to get approval for this inspiration, and Sri Yukteswar said to him, all doors are open. It's now or never. So we're in this pizza parlor, and Arjuna's found the ashram. And Swami sort of sighs, and he turns to me because I happen to be sitting next to him. All doors are open. It's now or never. And I knew exactly what he was referring to. Yes, sir. Seems to be what's happening. That's because I'm just reminiscing here, seemingly. I'll just finish a little part of that. When Swamiji left India in 1962, he had in his suitcase the orange clothes that he'd worn there, the typical garb of a Swami, which at that time, any sadhu walked around like that. So we had cotton kurtas and dhotis and so on. And I was familiar with these clothes, and he had brought back from India Garawa. Garawa is just like clay that looks somewhat similar to the earth at Ananda village. It's this big lump of ochre-colored clay, and that's what they dyed their clothes with. So over the course of the years at Ananda village, I had often re-dyed his clothes with this big lump of Garo. It's a terribly, inefficient dye. It washes out and it streaks, but I did the best I could. So all of a sudden, out of his closet, he pulls this stack of the same clothes that he'd worn in India, and this big hunk of Garawa. And well, since I'm going back to India, and so I walked up the road from his house. For those of you who were familiar with the Assisi landscape, Narya and Laura, Narya, that's his name, Narya and Laura have their house at the corner of the road, and then there's a long driveway, and Swami's house is off the road, off the main road, like this. So I went up to Laura's house because she had this big laundry room, and she and I and Cecilia just spent the afternoon grading the Garawa and re-dyeing these clothes, and the clothes were spotted and just stained, but they were extremely precious. So then we ended up with this long clothesline with all of these freshly dyed clothes, which was just a vision, because in Italy he dressed in very fine Italian clothes. Laura bought him very finely tailored Italian things, so he walked around looking like an Italian gentleman. So now we have all this real super sadhu stuff hanging out on the line here. Swamiji, with a group of friends, just comes walking up the road and saw it all blowing in the wind there. And then he said to someone, "Oh, I feel now like I'm really going." It was all very extremely touching. Actually, by the time I got to India, I went and got him new clothes because he couldn't go anywhere in those. Although I know in India you can, but really they were way past their expiration date. They were relics to be cherished, but not real clothes for him to wear. Now, all of that had to do with where we are being in Boston right now, about to sort of walk through places that Master walked. We're probably sitting in a place that it's hard to imagine he didn't come in here. He lived in this building for a period of time. That he would not have found this chapel seems almost unthinkable. So we don't have photographs, or we don't have records. But yeah, I love to imagine, because I lived through so much of Swami's incarnation, his adult incarnation, and his service to Master cycle of time, his building of a mission. And the way the Master works with his disciple, it's the Master himself just can only do so much. It's just one incarnation. Plus, what is the point? We have to understand that Master had nothing to learn. There was no lessons he had to prove here. There was no karma to finish. I laughed once. A lot of people like me, but not everyone. And there was a man living in my community, our community in Palo Alto, and I just wasn't his favorite person. And he came and he sat in front of me, and I'm really not sure what he hoped to accomplish. Maybe he just needed to clear the air between us. So he sat down and he said a few things, and then he said, I just don't find you at all inspiring. And my first response was total compassion. "Oh, you poor man," I said, "I talk all the time." I just thought how awful it was. Class after class, Sunday service after Sunday service, just sitting there getting nothing at all. And then the second thing, he just made a list of things that I wasn't doing as well as they could be done. I mean, what could I say? They weren't. And I just smiled at him and I said, "Do you think if I already knew how to do this job, I would still be doing it?" Of course I'm riddled with faults here. If I were perfect at this, I wouldn't have to keep at it. That's just the way we are. I mean, people think they're just really driving the stake into your heart by telling you, "You have karma." Chances are pretty good I do. Yeah. Why be horrified? Why be so shocked? You just relax and say, "Yeah, we're all in this together." I mean, if it's more than you can stand, you're going to have to move. What can I say? But here it is. But Master didn't. Master had, there was no reason. He wasn't Jivan Mukta even. He was free. There was nothing bringing him here. He did it for one reason only, out of deep, deep, deep compassion for all of us. Swamiji would often joke saying that once he was free, and Master had promised him this was the end for him. And Brighu said the same, and the Agastya reading said the same. It was all, when the Brighu is that book, from 5,000 years ago that has everybody's lives in it. And usually they give you a past life and a future life. And when the Brighu reading said to Swamiji, well, I can give you a past life, but there is no future life. There's just, this is it. There's not going to be one after this. And Swami would speak of that with a lot of enthusiasm. He thought that was a red-hot idea. He was ready to be done. But then especially toward the end, he began to say things like, but I know myself. I know that, in fact, he said this to me on the phone when he was talking about dying, when I was talking earlier before India. He said, he just really doesn't want to be in this world anymore. He has really finished. The only thing that concerns him, the only thing that could bring him back is all of us. And I just said, but sir, that's the only reason you came this time, isn't it? Well, he said, yes, I suppose that's true. Just like that. But toward the end, he kept saying, I know myself. I know what's going to happen. I'm going to start being concerned. We had a funny conversation before he was there. We were sitting in a restaurant. We were traveling from Ananda village to San Francisco, and we started talking about the yuga and about what a fairly rotten yuga early Dwapara is in terms of, several different groups. We've just been talking about all the incredibly, even just having to come in and register and this whole thing. I'm not against their doing it, but the fact that they have to do it is what's so heartbreaking, really. But this is early Dwapara. It's better than it was, but it's not a whole lot better. This is the material plane, and it's really fairly gross. There's still wars all over the place and all kinds of terrible things happening. So I jokingly said to Swamiji, sir, if you do come back, and we all have to come with you, why don't we wait for a higher yuga? Let's not do this one again. This is kind of like not the best. It was funny to me because he was eating at the moment and he had a mouthful of sandwich. But with his mouth full, he said, I never intend to come back. I never intend to come back, he said. Later he modified it. But then interestingly, just to finish the thought, he said, even in Satya Yuga, he said, it's still the material plane, it's not heaven. It's not spiritual freedom. He said, but in Satya Yuga, people like us are in charge. Isn't that nice? And I said, so the whole planet is like Ananda? He says, yes. So at least it'd be more pleasant. But then he said, but still, you're not content here because you want God realization and that's what you have to have. So it's very sweet. But later he talked about that he would come back. I hope he gets a good rest. And then I hope he comes back tomorrow so that we can still see him again. It's a good thing to think about, because when a great soul materializes, he'll just be a child. But the full consciousness will be there. That's the three wise men coming to the baby Jesus. What could the baby Jesus do? He couldn't, lo, my children, and explain to them, the meaning of the Old Testament. But everything about him was present. Really, it's a very fascinating. All of these things are just fascinating too. They're great. They're fruit of meditation. When your mind is beginning to feel a little, how would I say it? When the meditation is not so sweet and not so rich, you can just contemplate things like that and bring yourself into a different bhav, which is very renewing for meditation. You have to be a little creative there. So when Master came to do the work here, he tells the story. He lands in Boston. God brings him to Boston, which of course is no accident. And don't you all Bostonians get all puffed up about it. But nonetheless, he did. This is where he came. When I traveled, the first time I left the U.S., I didn't leave America until 1982, and then I was married to David, and David and I took our honeymoon with Swamiji. We then took a real honeymoon afterwards, but we traveled for 6 weeks in Europe with him. He went on a lecture tour, and we accompanied him. Then we sent him back to the US and went to Greece, just so we could actually say we'd had a real honeymoon. But I'd never been out of the country before. And I was so struck because I didn't realize that America has no past. I mean, you don't think about that if you were just like me and had only lived in America. We're, what, 200 years old or 200 plus now? And there was a fine indigenous culture here, which we obliterated immediately and do not in any way relate to as our own history. So basically America's, and this is what the power of the country, there's nothing and we make something. And that's why Master found it such fabulous, fruitful soil for self-realization. Because Americans just believe, well, there's nothing and we'll make something out of it. And we don't think it's hard to do. And in fact, Master said that. In India, they know how hard it is to realize God, so they're not inclined to throw themselves into it like we are. In America, we think, well, if it can be done, we'll do it. And even though that spirit can be annoying at times, spiritually speaking, it's not a bad idea. You just go that way. So America was really the only country where it could have started. Partly it was destiny. I often wonder who was George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all the founding fathers, because America was so essential to this whole cycle of Dwapara Yuga. It just, America is the Dwapara Yuga country. Whatever ups and downs the country is going through now, because it is. Master emphatically said that America's karma is good. And because of what we did to the American Indians, he said we have some bad karma to pay. And because we did that out of greed, it'll come out of our wallets. That's basically, we're going to hit, that's the reason for the serious depression that Master predicts for this country, is the karma of the Indians. Interestingly, and this is just by the way, he did not say the karma of slavery of the black people, which for many years I just put them both together, and then somehow the detail got corrected. He only mentioned the American Indians. And Swami raised a very interesting point. Now I know this may not be politically correct, so just like be impersonal about this, okay? That, you know, the continent of Africa is really it remains chaotic. And Swami had commented about the fact that he thinks, karmically speaking, that the continent went toward black magic. That's what happened to the Egyptian civilization. And that then the karma of the continent toward black magic is still not finished. And that's why they have so much trouble stabilizing in that world. Bear in mind that there's no such thing as an African soul or an American soul. We just hang out in the astral world and look for the pattern that's going to suit our karma. And then we drop into whatever culture that is. But the culture is created to give the individual souls the opportunity to experience those conditions. So you're not being punished, but the karma is held there so that everybody can have it the right place. In the astral world, all the choices we have. Oh, I need to go someplace where they're paying off the karma of black magic. Because whatever it is, maybe I was part of that, or maybe that is what I need. But one of our black members who went to Africa and sort of saw what they struggle with there, and he said, it's the first time I've ever been grateful for slavery. He said, because a whole huge segment of that group was brought out of that country, and certainly they went through barbarous conditions here, but now that race is represented in a completely different way, even the President of America right now. And Swamiji has just proposed that, you know, that group of that race will eventually be instrumental in bringing that homeland back up again. Isn't that just, you stand back and you just think, why do I ever worry about anything? Right. But so here we are with the American reality, and he came here, Master came here, because this is a place where you can start churches. Our Italian friends were just so confused by the fact that we were starting a church. Like, you don't start churches, there's just the church, you know? And in America, we're always starting churches. Anybody can start a church, you know? So we're starting a church. In Italy, they couldn't call what we're doing there a church. It was just ludicrous. It was impossible. So they used the Indian word sangha. Just no way. But Master arrives here, and he knows what he's doing, but he's in the play. We were talking about this a little while ago. For any of you who have ever done any acting and with a costume and your entrance on. I was watching the ballet in New York when I was there a couple of days ago, and the dancer just does her great leap and then flies off into the wings. And you know, as soon as she's behind the curtain there, you know, she's flat-footed and puffing and probably drinking a little water, just getting ready to race out there again. But as soon as she comes out, all of that is forgotten, and she's just on that stage. And if you're in an act with a play with no intermissions, in which you never go into the wings, you just put that costume on, you don that personality, you step into the flow of whatever's happening, and you don't stop until it's finished.